Welcome to tonight's presentations and discussions on the very current topics of same-sex formal unions and marriage. Later we'll also hear from Amy Hamilton on the topic of transgenderism, which also are topics that have implications for us as a society, as well as for many individuals. And we know that the topics that we are going to discuss tonight, like getting married and having children, are both important milestones, and for some people they are sensitive topics. Our aim is to seek out as much of the truth as possible so that we can make these decisions as a society that creates as much of the greater good now and in the future as possible. And we have together a very good panel for that, I think, together with experts as well.
Yes, so our main guest today is Mark Regnerus. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Austin in the United States. He's an author of 4 books and over 40 articles and book chapters, and he's writing on topics of sexual behavior, family and marriage. Professor Regnerus, we're very, very lucky and very, very glad to have you here tonight.
Pleasure to have you here.
Good to be here. I want to talk a little bit tonight about relationships of different sorts, including marriage, because my understanding is the issues that are before the Parliament here in Vilnius revolve around non-marital relationships, but as we've seen around the globe, it is usually a short pathway from discussion of one kind of relationship legalized to the equation of these relationships with marriage. So I'm going to just lead you through about a 35 to 40 minute discussion of different aspects of how to think about the law here, how to think about empirical studies here, and how to think about the idea and the centrality of dignity, which is a word that's, frankly, I think, increasingly abused in the legal system, and as it sort of migrates from what it used to mean to what it means today. So I think the most important question about marriage and relationships that eventually comes before the world's parliaments, legislatures, and courts is not a question about whether marriage is both a universal and an unchangeable institution. Because the answer to that question is both yes and no. Yes, marriage is a universal institution. But no, the institution is not unchangeable. Much about marriage has varied over centuries and millennia, even over decades, including imperatives about consent, shifting age minimums, norms about timing of marriage, standards of marriageability, which have risen, and how civic and financial benefits accrue to marriage as well as to other marriage-like relationships. The most important question is not whether marriage may look differently across time and culture. It has, and it will continue to. The most important question, rather, is whether the very core of marriage, its constitutive structure, can be changed or not. If that really can be changed, then no particular trait of the institution is secure, and its future is one of recession towards historical obscurity. But if the core of marriage is not alterable, then the most that any court, any legislature, or any parliament could ever do is alter its de jure status, what the law says about it. So the most important question facing judiciaries and parliaments is not about discerning rights or whether to reward a particular moral or popular position or an interest group. The most important question is discerning what marriage is, and then ensuring the law reflects that reality and protects that reality. Marriage's de facto structure, in reality, in fact, as the union of a man and a woman, it can be battered, it can be bruised by civil neglect, by ecclesiastical neglect, cultural derision, popular disregard. But it cannot be destroyed, since the structure is robust and its core not actually alterable. So while it may be increasingly popular for parliaments and courts to endorse particular alternative unions, it is irrational and short-sighted to undermine the archetype by endorsing legal status for alternatives. In much of the West, marriage now competes more than ever with other life priorities. Demographers increasingly speak of what they call the second demographic transition. In developed societies, it's believed that men and women alike are losing the motivation to marry and to have children. And so they increasingly delay or avoid one or both of those. Marriage in one's 20s has receded dramatically in the West. The free fall in marriage is obvious over just a few decades, the blink of an eye in human history. Marriage during the most fertile years of women's lifespan, the ages 20 to 29, has rapidly shifted from expected to uncommon. In Lithuania today, only 18% of women have married by age 30, a figure that's well below even most of their European colleagues. Do you know what the figure was in 1989, marriage by age 30 among women? 85%. 10 years ago, 42%. Now, 18%. It's falling off a cliff. So has marriage changed? Or have people changed their minds about marriage? Well, at least 4 characteristics about marriage have not changed. How do I know? By observing marriages, interviews, observations. One can conduct ethnographies of marriage and see it. Some things don't change. So what are they? Well, first, marriage is generally understood as a comprehensive union. It involves a sharing of life together, a linking of minds, wills, actions, resources. It's not just sharing a household. It's prioritizing the other person. The philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand aptly describes this trait, this comprehensiveness, as the beloved person is the object of our thoughts, our sentiments, our will, our hope, our longing. She becomes the center of our life as far as created goods and time are connected. Philosopher Edith Stein characterized it this way: man and woman are destined to live one life with one another like a single being. We don't simply live with our beloved, we live for them. This is why prenuptial agreements continue to prompt misgivings. Such arrangements, like a debt or an asset that one spouse brings to the union, shouldn't be the concern of another, they say. But it's holding back. Moreover, many civil authorities treat sham marriages, those that are entered into for purposes of gaining some desired material benefit, like an immigration right or something, as not just deceitful, but illegal. Families, friends, and communities certainly don't celebrate these kinds of marriages because it implies this kind of calculated utilitarian agreement. They're not comprehensive unions. Second, most marrying couples anticipate having children if they're able to. This is the case even though contraception is widely practiced. Couples differ on how many children they hope to have and when, and that number is certainly diminishing. Yet even couples who intend to be childless often find themselves revisiting the issue. So entrenched is the notion of equating children with marriage. Couples struggling with infertility consider it a profound sadness, as do those of us who are friends. It's a disappointment. We still equate marriage with childbearing. Third, people expect marriage to be permanent, a lifelong union. Talk of short-term rolling contracts in which a couple must opt back in every few years are ridiculed. Divorce, on the other hand, is widely held to be lamentable. They're popular, but they're not celebrated. Even when the separation brings relief, there always remains a sense of what could have been. Couples who marry intend to stay married. It's a permanent piece of marriage. And fourth, sexual exclusivity or fidelity are expected in marriage. And this is not merely a religious norm. Some people balk at this notion and suggest instead, it's an expectation. It's a social or a cultural artifact that could be otherwise. Observing marriages, however, tells a different story. Infidelity may be experienced, but only ever as an exception, a violation of the norm, a mistake, a tragedy, a signal something well short of what was hoped for and intended. Even in an era where marriage is entered into years later than previously, and fewer people are marrying than ever before, these four traits of marriage remain reliable expectations. They are not, as some would put it, social constructions. Perhaps then, marriage has not so much changed as it has receded. A strong argument can be made that what has changed, rather, is what people emotionally expect of marriage. What it should look like, what it should feel like. Love is love, we're told, and all you need is love. But love as an emotion is not at the core of marriage. Couples do not marry in order to experience love. They marry because they love already and wish to experience what marriage is. There are seasons in marriage, and everybody knows it, when love is more difficult. If one or both spouses believes that sentiments of love are at the core of marriage, their union is more apt to be a fragile one and an unhappy one. Now, does marriage evolve? Some have sued for access to marriage or relationships short of marriage on the pathway to marriage over the past 20 plus years. They have done so appealing to the purported evolution of relationships and evolution of marriage. Away from the long-standing association of procreation and education of children. This is an idea that same-sex plaintiffs in the case Schock and Kopf v. Austria from 2010 claimed no longer forms an integral part of marriage, that is, children. According to these two men, a sense of comprehensiveness and stability were the key traits. In present-day perception, marriage, they held, was a permanent union encompassing all aspects of life. So fidelity is out, children are out. But given the biological impossibility of reproduction within the same-sex relationship represented in that case, it's no surprise that they are claiming marriage is evolution. But notice what else is missing, that fidelity piece, long associated and important with reproduction, increasingly absent from the discourse of marriage evolutionists. But if you observe the average marrying couple throughout the West, all four hallmarks still remain. Is fidelity a problem for gay unions? Yes. Using nationally representative data on couples' behavior collected in 2017, Stanford University demographer Michael Rosenfeld, with whom I have argued on the case of same-sex marriage, he observed that among civilly married gay men in the United States, fully 21% reported at least one other romantic or sexual relationship in the past year. 21% of gay married men in the United States reporting a same-sex relationship outside the marriage in the past year. It's a rate 6 times higher than was reported among men married to women, 13 times higher than was reported by women married to men. Among this 21% of married gay men, the average number of sexual partners they had in the past year was not just that second one, it was closer to 3. In a 12-year-long comparative study of couples whose original civil union commenced in 2000, 2001, tracked until 2014, 62% of respondents in that same-sex couple relationships reported sex outside of the relationship between those 2 years. 4 times as high as the rate seen among opposite-sex couples. Rosenfeld concludes in his study, and I quote him, "For gay men, being married appears to be uncorrelated with monogamy." Unrelated. Marriage unrelated to monogamy? Historically, a preposterous thought. In his 2015 book, Just Married, Princeton professor Stephen Macedo openly worried that gay men's interest in monogamy would undermine the wider norm of sexual fidelity in marriage among the masses. That means they would be mimicked by the rest of us. But upon reflection, I said, don't worry. We will never widely observe the disappearance of monogamy from marriage, since fidelity remains a long-standing expectation of it. We will not see fidelity falter because people would rather not get married than get married with the presumption that fidelity is possibility, unfidelity. At bottom, all of this highlights a fundamentally different kind of relationship than those anticipated widely by the marriages that we're familiar with. I am not claiming that. I'm saying it's what the data reflect. Subsequent analyses of Rosenfeld's data found that same-sex marriages were also less stable than opposite-sex marriages. Not just less faithful, but less stable. Just 23% of the same-sex marriages in his data had been dissolved by the 8th year of data collection. 23% compared to 11% of opposite-sex marriages. Male-male unions were notably less likely to become a formalized union than women's unions and male-female unions. But stability was lowest, not among the men, but among the women. 6 out of every 10 female same-sex unions had dissolved within 20 years. A figure well above that of everyone else. You hear the term, at least in the United States, with half of all marriages end in divorce. I don't know if they say this in Lithuania, but they do it in the United States. Half. Well, 60% of all women's same-sex unions end not within 40 years or 50 years, within 20 years. A 17-year-long analysis of relationships in Sweden, progressive Sweden, revealed that women in same-sex unions exhibited a divorce rate twice as high as did other kinds of unions, suggesting this is not a short-term fluke. Despite wide and increasing social acceptance of different kinds of unions, the same pattern is discernible in Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the United States, England, Spain, Wales. None of this came as a surprise to earlier sociologists who were writing about this 25 years ago. Famous British intellectual and sociologist Anthony Giddens, writing in his book 1992, The Transformation of Intimacy, said lesbian women may be in a long-term relationship, but they have difficulty gaining a sense of security in them, unquote. He was right then. He remains correct today. In fact, while declining relationship quality predicted women's relationship dissolution, it was entirely unassociated with the dissolution of heterosexual and men's same-sex relationships. One pair of sociologists attributed this tendency towards breakup to lesbian couples' higher standards. But there's no theoretical reason to think that lesbians in particular have higher relationship standards than other people. Rather, women in general tend to have higher relationship standards. Indeed, men and women tend to conduct their relationships in different ways and exhibit distinctive preferences in their relationships. But when the relationship varies from one of sexual difference, that is, a man and woman in a relationship, to one of sameness, you get long-standing sex-typed preferences that are consolidated and exacerbated rather than moderated or tempered by the need to navigate sexual difference. So this means that, ironically, same-sex relationships are subject to more deeply rooted gendered relationship patterns and habits, despite their stated egalitarian norms. So studies of the internal workings and dynamics of same-sex relationships reveals these predictable sex-typed behaviors. Distinctions like caregiving, monitoring, that are consonant with what we might expect from women, whether in relationship with a man or another woman, appear here too. There's nothing political about this. It's just the empirical reality. If marriage was a social construction, utterly malleable, changeable, we should see little stable distinction in what men and women prioritize about in relationships and how they act within them. But we have always seen them, and we always will. Now, younger sexual and gender minority adults, a sociologist whom I know from the United States observed recently, she said, quote, "These are less likely to value faithfulness and lifelong commitment than heterosexual young adults." Why? Because these norms are considered, quote, "boring, sexist, monogamous, and confining," unquote. Now remember, the plaintiffs in Schock and Kopf v. Austria claimed that only comprehensiveness and permanence characterized marriage today. But that case is 10 years old now. Expectations of permanence now are dissipating too. So all we have left then is a comprehensive union. The endemic levels of extramarital partners among men in same-sex unions that I described, and the absence of discussion about elevated dissolution rates among same-sex female couples raised questions about what other empirical information about same-sex households is put in the background, no longer discussed, or ignored in judicial and congressional and parliamentary discussions about the topic. One of the earliest and consistently most challenging empirical discussions was about same-sex households with children. United States Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, who's probably famous the world over now, in his 2013 decision, U.S. v. Windsor, claimed that it humiliates tens of thousands of children now being raised by same-sex couples. 2 years later, tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands in his lingo. In Obergefell v. Hodges, he said hundreds of thousands of children are presently being raised by such couples. Which is it? Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands? Is it millions? The number of same-sex households, as well as a count of children living within them, has never been simple to tally. In fact, demographers reported in 2020, just the last year, that, quote, same-sex family dynamics is often based on relatively sketchy quantitative data. In particular, they said, there's still very little reliable quantitative data and demographic analyses of family dynamics in relationship to childbearing and parenthood in same-sex unions, unquote. Last year, they're saying, we still don't have good data on this. The actual figure continues to be elusive, but generally underwhelming. In progressive Western Europe, the most recent estimates of children raised in same-sex households are even lower than in the United States. In the Netherlands, 0.2% of all children are being raised in two-parent families in the Netherlands. Two-parent, same-sex families. 2 out of every 1,000 children are being raised by a same-sex couple in one of the most progressive countries in the world. But it gets even more staggering. 96% of those are in same-sex female couples. In a countrywide data set, they observed only 125 children living in male same-sex households. Countrywide data set, the Netherlands. 96% raised by women. This is a stunning figure, prompting questions about how a tiny cadre of a small minority is commanding the majority. Now, overestimates here are not that unusual. Today, there's a consensus among scholars that about 2 to 4% of the adult population in the United States identifies as gay or lesbian. But the population at large, what do they think? The average American believes that 25% of the American population is gay or lesbian, and has done so for years. The last 3 surveys, Americans think that 1 in 4 Americans is gay or lesbian, even though all the scholars know that it's 2 to 4%. That's from the most prestigious polling firm in the country. But it's also a signal of how co-opted sort of even the empirical imagination has become. How difficult it is to find the truth of things. That 2 to 4% scholarly consensus stands in stark contrast to repeated claims made about the obvious consensus in the social scientific literature on how children fare in same-sex households, a domain I explored 9 years ago and remember it painfully very well. Indeed, before there was even 1 second random sample of more than 50 children living in same-sex households, 2 American sociologists had already declared a consensus on the conclusions of how they fared based on small, non-representative studies. To quote them, they said, "We do not yet have research that compares the children of married same-sex and different-sex couples. We don't have it. Even so, scholars have achieved a rare degree of consensus that unmarried lesbian parents are raising children who develop at least as well as their counterparts with married heterosexual parents." It's empirically kind of a strange statement. We don't have the data, but we still have a consensus. The American Academy of Pediatrics, which historically reserves judgment on scientific claims until consistently confirmed with stronger samples, had already endorsed that claim in 2002, 19 years ago. Given the diversity of same-sex households, this would be akin to claiming that one could come to a consensus conclusion about Lithuanian politics by fielding a survey, a convenience survey, to people walking on the street outside this building in Vilnius and declaring what they said was true of all Lithuanians. It's ridiculous. While differences between heterosexual and same-sex households with children are often apparent at face value, once you control for or statistically set aside household instability, the kind I just described, it becomes easier then to conclude that the sexual orientation of parents does not directly cause problems for children, which means that controlling for household instability is now the norm in statistical practice, because the goal is to conclude that there are no differences, and you get to conclude that by controlling for instability. Something that I just talked about is endemic to women's same-sex relationships. But as I just noted, when analysts control for instability, the effects of this pattern are removed from consideration, meaning we don't care about instability anymore. We want to know about the direct effect of same-sex couples on children. One sociologist admitted that he was frequently encouraged to withhold research findings until after marriage equality had been achieved in the United States, unquote. And he observed that the national debate and the scrutiny on same-sex parents had only heightened the pressure to demonstrate the worthiness of same-sex parents by presenting idealized image of LGBTQ people, unquote. As I noted at the beginning of this talk, lawmakers, parliamentarians, judges can alter the legal boundaries of civil marriages and unions as they wish. The sky is the limit to what marriage can handle in de jure status in the law. What human societies are unable to do, however, is alter the terms of the social institution of marriage itself, the core structure and norms. Those are not bound by civil marriage laws. They embody a logic of their own. And what have we learned? Only 6 years into nationwide same-sex marriage in the United States, rates of uptake remain far below those of opposite-sex couples. Data from the 2018 National Health Information Survey reveal that LGBT adult men are married at 1/3 the rate of heterosexual men. LGBT women married at 1/2 the rate of heterosexual women. By comparison, the Dutch population, 0.9% of all couples are same-sex couples. Marriage has been there legal since 2001, 20 years. 38% of both male and female same-sex couples were married, compared with 62% of cohabiting couples. Far below opposite-sex couples, among whom 86% were married. Some jurists in courts and parliaments have signaled their preference for letting the people decide, letting voters. This preference appears to be a conservative defense of sorts, a recognition that if civil marriage law should change, more people should weigh in on the matter than just a handful of judges or some parliamentarians. But frankly, people should not be required to vote in a plebiscite on the significance of this union. Even worse, a legislature or a parliament voting on what a marriage is. How do you know it? You observe it over time, space, and culture, which has already been done. Now, despite my obsession with data on this domain, empirical social reality is not the primary way in which arguments in favor of altering what we consider marriage are typically made. Instead, a philosophical idea, once rooted in theological discourse, has been far more influential than any accounting of data has been. I'm referring to the concept of dignity, whose definition, like that of marriage, seems to be evolving. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, borrowing from a rich patrimony of Christian tradition before it, understood dignity, at least in 1948, as an irrevocable personal trait. Dignity, of course, is empirically unmeasurable, outside the realm of social sciences to evaluate. It's ironic that as marriage retreats broadly across the West, judicial decisions increasingly seem saturated with remarks about how marriage confers and conveys dignity upon a sexual union. Famously, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy aligned dignity tightly with human autonomy and the right to define oneself. The famous one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life, unquote. They used the word dignity at least 10 times in his 2013 decision, U.S. v. Windsor. Now, marriage may be thought to exhibit dignity, since it is born of the free, consensual union of persons, but it does not confer dignity. But it's no surprise that today many people believe that marriage in fact does confer dignity, by which most people actually are meaning a sense of nobility. This is largely due to this shift in thinking of marriage as a capstone rather than a foundation, a mentality that is now pronounced throughout the West, as expectations of the psychological satisfactions of marriage rise in step with the average age at marriage. When we think of marriage as a capstone, marriage becomes less of a populist institution and more of a cultural marker of elite prestige, something that conveys a sense of accomplishment, due respect, and perhaps a sense of dignity. But if marriage doesn't confer dignity, what does marriage signal? Judge Richard Posner, generally a conservative, in his Baskin v. Bogan decision overturning the state of Indiana's ban on same-sex marriage, said that marriage confers respectability on a sexual relationship. To exclude a couple from marriage is thus to deny it a coveted status. A coveted status. How coveted is it, really, when your population is putting it off years and years? That doesn't sound very coveted to me. Demanding more emotional satisfactions from it than the union is designed to carry. Now, justice does not demand that marriage is equal because the dignity of persons is not at stake in marriage law. Resisting to one's wish to marry someone of the same sex can offend their sense of dignity. But that's distinctive from damaging the real thing. We can recognize the dignity of persons by acknowledging and respecting their freedom to form relationships or their parental rights. It is neither animus nor an injury to human dignity, though, to state and identify that one relationship is a marriage and another relationship is not. Certainly the institution of marriage is part of that which is valuable enough for Lithuania to be obliged to bequeath it to future generations. In support of the Lithuanian autonomy, the European Court of Human Rights pledges member states discretion here. There's no European consensus on the matter of gender identification and same-sex marriage, at least not in their official documents, unlike their more recent proclamations. The margin of appreciation, which is in the documents, to be afforded to member states must still be a wide one, the text says, and the ECHR ruled in the 2014 Hämäläinen v. Finland. The facts on the ground suggest a prudential path. No one is keeping same-sex couples from conducting their relationships. Same-sex marriage, however, would enshrine in law what is impossible in structure and hence inconsonant in norm. Marriage remains heteronormative, which is increasingly sounding like it's a bad word. Marriage is heteronormative, meaning it reflects how men and women distinctively relate to each other, moderating each other. That will not change in step with legal attempts to unravel the core of marriage or to make incremental inroads towards that, as now appears to be happening in Lithuania. But marriage will not be successfully deconstructed because it is not a mere social construction. As a result, the matter is not simply about expanded access to the same one thing, marriage. It is about the creation and the endorsement of two additional forms of marriage, yielding three types in total, not two types, not one type. We have increasing attention towards one heterosexual type and two homosexual types, together with the distinctive, predictable patterns that result from consolidating sex differences rather than moderating them. The current effort to undermine Lithuanian marriage law, slowly but surely, is not about respecting national autonomy. It's not about ensuring children experience life with their biological mothers and fathers. What we're witnessing now is the beginning of a cultural land grab rather than the product of a genuine and wide desire to legally access an institution and seek to mimic its norms. Because I gave you evidence, empirical evidence, that it is not about seeking to mimic those norms. It's about seeking to overturn those norms, leaving the only thing an ideal of some sort of comprehensive, unclear union, temporary. And it's about giving a tiny, and in the United States at least, a generally privileged elite what they wish in response to claims of discrimination and in return for the false promise that national, provincial, and village culture can be left alone. They most assuredly will not. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll have now some time for questions, and I don't know about you,
Okay. So before we move to the comments of Mr. Vaičaitis, I would like to give you a short question. You've mentioned this in your speech, and it was about how psychological different personality traits among men and women influence different kind of ways relationships grow in same-sex couples and in opposite-sex couples. And you mentioned a little bit, you talked about this a little bit, but maybe you could make it more complete. And so why is this so? Why does it happen?
It really shouldn't surprise us. Men and women are different. That's basically at the core of this claim, that men generally esteem certain kinds of values, norms, behaviors, and women different ones, right? It doesn't mean that we can't be quite similar in other ways. It doesn't mean that, so if we want to think about gender as sort of more about stereotypes and behaviors that sort of lean in the more masculine or more feminine, it's not unusual to think that my wife might differ from me in interests, behavioral practices, expectations. I'm happy to admit that she has probably higher standards and expectations of emotional satisfaction in our marriage than I do, right? Which is completely unusual among men, right? We're able to tolerate, difficulty and sort of trouble inside the relationship for longer. Okay? Women get more upset quickly, right? On average, right? And so this isn't done away with when you see same-sex relationships. Frankly, it's like lesbians are still women, and that is the most important thing about it. And when women form relationships with other women, you consolidate these types, and that lack of difference kind of exacerbates it and can create more tension. So when my wife and I disagree about something, and she's unhappy with me for the 1,000th time, right? I try to make her happy, okay? And I was like, okay, I've got to listen to her better, right? So I navigate this with someone of difference from me, recognizing that she's distinctive and requires treatment in a way that I would not treat a friend, right? Or I would not treat if I was in a relationship with another man, because he's more like me, right? So the navigation of sexual difference is an understated theme, and frankly, an understated talent, right? We have learned how to navigate each other. So I think that's an underappreciated aspect of this. So it's not a surprise then that gay men's unions are less sexually faithful. Is it because they're gay? No, it's because they're men. Their relationships with other men who are willing to cut deals with them because they too are men and they know the attractions of sex outside the relationship. I know the attractions of it, I just don't get to do it, right? Because I'm in a relationship with a woman who will not accept it, right? Does that make sense?
Thank God they're different, right? I mean, my sisters, they keep telling me it's good that you have your wife, otherwise poor daughter. I mean, if it would be two of you.
That's right, exactly.
Poor daughter. And also as a father, I mean, if there wouldn't be any difference between men and women, then what's my role as a father? What do I bring to the table, you know? Right. And there is that distinct pattern, whereas the women the mother would say, oh, you hit and fell your head, well, come here, I'll hug you a little bit. And the father would be like, oh, you hit and fell your head, well, next time you're going to do better. Let me show you how you can do it again.
Oh, you're fine.
Right? And then they learn to ride the bike. So
pick yourself up. Wipe yourself off and keep going.
For me, you know, formalized same-sex marriages has always been a core argument about parenthood and motherhood, you know. And it was really interesting. Maybe we can even now generalize a little bit, because you said that 96% of the 0.2% of children living in same-sex relationships have
This is mothers. In the Netherlands.
Right, yeah. So we could look to maybe it's a woman-woman relationship. And okay, I don't argue with you on the data, I've also seen it, that those marriages are less stable. But it's also the case that heterosexual and homosexual unions that are not formalized, so not married, cohabitation, for example, are less stable than woman-woman marriage. And you know, I think one argument that's perhaps to some merit put forward as an argument for formalized partnerships for same-sex couples is that, well, then they could adopt some children, and maybe it's better for the children to live within that union than to not be adopted at all. What would you say to such a...
Yeah, it's a complicated subject that's been brought up, and I take no formalized position on the matter of adoption, in part because adoption is a concession to the ideal by definition. I mean, it reflects the recognition that in an ideal world, this child will be able to stay with its mother and father who are united in love for each other and a commitment to each other. And that's not the case for whatever reason. So it's considered a tragedy at some level why the child needs adoption, right? I don't actually take much of a position on how widely adoption rights ought to be or not be. I mean, I think ideally, as we just described, it's helpful when a child has access to a married mother and father, right? So that they can grow up in a union that is considered more secure, right, as we already demonstrated, and that demonstrates difference, right, sexual difference, so the child can grow up knowing these things. Now, it's undermined, this idea that they need to understand sexual difference, because across the West, we're undermining sexual difference entirely, saying like, you know, in theory, we ought to be gender neutral, right? And that men ought to become more like women, women like men, and a just future is one without gender. Susan Mahler-Oken argued that 30 years ago. And now in the West, especially in the United States, France, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, we're seeing pushes towards this sort of gender neutrality. But I think, you know, if we back to
well, sociological data moves move to the other side, though, that it's more excavated, let's say, in Sweden.
Right. So I really don't have a strong opinion on the subject of adoption. I just think, apart from being able to grow up in a comprehensive union between a man and a woman, and love with each other, and love with the child, you know, then you're talking about, like, is this better or worse than growing up with a single mother, right?
Right, like something that's already not ideal. Can we make it slightly better? Right.
So, yeah, I really don't take a position on those kinds of minutiae questions, apart from the impossibility of the ideal.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I have time for comments and questions from Mr. Vaičaitis. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with you, and although I'm not a sociologist, but I just try to remember my classes on family law, you know? And we were taught that to think of family law from the perspective of priority interest of the family. So we were taught that in the beginning, from the Romans, it was the father, the pater familia, who used to represent the family. So he was the head of the family, and all interest was put from the perspective of the father. So then in the 20th century, the mother was in the center of the interest, because she needs to bear the kids, and so all the rights should be put on the mother. And in the end of the 20th century, I was taught that the interest of children should be in the center of the family concept. In family law, for instance, if you divorce, so that you put the bargain, you put the interest on the children. It is the best for children. So, and now when I was listening to your interesting speech, I was thinking also of the moving a pattern a bit, even in Lithuania, and in Europe, and in other countries, that now we are probably talking about the interest of the emotions of couple. Right. Exactly. Not anymore, mother, father, or a child. But so, would you agree to that?
I think that is an accurate statement. So the ascendance of emotions as directing what is good in some ways seems to be making inroads in the law, right? More than sort of the interests of the children or the mother or the father. It's like, what do we feel like doing? What do we feel? Who do we feel like we are? So, for the longest time, I would presume in law and in empirical studies, we didn't treat feelings with a great deal of seriousness, and now it's almost as if it's ascendant.
Yeah, that's. And just to continue, because emotions are not so legal term,
right?
But nevertheless, judges and the courts, they use, even in Lithuania, that they, in order to define legally, to define family, they include also emotions. And for me as a lawyer, I have some difficulties with that, because emotions are very subjective, well, if I would try to build my understanding of family and family concept, to defend the family just on emotions, or not only just on them, but also on emotions, I have some difficulties.
Yeah. So to describe sort of this sex differences, then you're going to see different emotions, men, women, etc., such that you could have judges ruling on the veracity or the truthfulness of a relationship based on whether the man thinks it exists or not. I mean, men and women disagree about whether they're in a relationship quite often, right? When you're looking at romantic relationships. So, you know, are you going to believe the earnestness of the woman versus the sort of skepticism of the man? I mean, it's a kind of a ludicrous place for the law to rest, really.
Okay, thank you very much.